December 24th, 1944, 6:30 p.m. A tiny hunting cabin in the Ardennes forest, on the German-Belgian border. 12-year-old Fritz Winken was helping his mother prepare their modest Christmas Eve dinner when they heard it. A knock on the door, in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a war, on Christmas Eve. Fritz's mother, Elizabeth, froze. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge was raging, the largest battle American forces would ever fight. Artillery rumbled in the distance. The forest was filled with soldiers from both sides, lost, desperate, dying in the snow. Nobody came to their cabin, ever. They were miles from any village, hidden deep in the woods. Fritz's father was away, fighting somewhere on the Eastern Front. It was just Elizabeth and Fritz, trying to survive in a cabin with no electricity. Running water, barely any food. Another knock. Louder this time, Fritz whispered, "Mama, what if it's soldiers?" Elizabeth Winken took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and did something that would either save lives or get them both killed. She opened the door. 3 American soldiers stood in the doorway. One was barely standing, held up by his companions. Blood soaked through his uniform. His face was white as the snow around them. The soldier in front didn't speak German. Elizabeth didn't speak English. But both understood the universal language of a dying man. One of the Americans managed to say, "Help, please." Elizabeth Winken made her decision in seconds. Harboring enemy soldiers was punishable by death under Nazi law. But it was Christmas Eve, and a boy was bleeding to death in her doorway. She pulled them inside. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in less than an hour, 4 German soldiers would knock on that same door, and Elizabeth Winken would have to prevent 7 enemy soldiers from killing each other inside her tiny cabin. On Christmas Eve, 1944, in a forest cabin barely larger than your living room, the war would stop. Not because of generals or politicians or treaties, because one mother said, "Not in my house." This is the true story of the Christmas miracle of 1944. Every word is verified, every detail real. This is what happened when humanity won, even if just for one night. Before I tell you what happened that night, you need to understand something important. This story was almost lost forever. Fritz Winken, the 12-year-old boy who witnessed everything, didn't tell anyone about that Christmas for nearly 30 years. Not his friends, not even his wife. It wasn't until 1973, 29 years after that night, that Fritz, now living in Hawaii and working as a baker, finally wrote down what he remembered. He sent his story to a magazine. The editor didn't believe it. Too perfect. To Hollywood, it had to be fiction. But Fritz had details. Names, he remembered. Specific conversations, the smell of the roasted chicken his mother prepared. The sound of American and German voices mixing in broken phrases. The feel of the cold cabin floor under his feet while he watched enemy soldiers shake hands. The magazine published it. Within weeks, letters started arriving, from all over America, from Germany. From men who said, "I was there. I was one of those soldiers." What Fritz had witnessed wasn't just real. It was one of the most documented small-scale truces of World War II, because the men who lived it never forgot. They spent decades trying to find each other again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how this all began. Not on Christmas Eve, but months earlier, when a German mother made a choice that would save her son's life and change 7 soldiers forever. Elizabeth Winken was a baker's wife from Aachen, Germany. She and her husband Hermann owned a small bakery. They had one son, Fritz, born in 1932. Life was simple, predictable, working-class German. Then the war came to Aachen. By 1944, Aachen sat directly in the path of the Allied advance into Germany. The city was bombed repeatedly. The Winkens' bakery was destroyed in an air raid in September 1944. Their home, gone. Everything they owned, reduced to rubble. Hermann was conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets. Elizabeth and 12-year-old Fritz were left with nothing. But Hermann had owned a small hunting cabin deep in the Hurtgen forest near the Belgian border. It was primitive, One room, a wood stove. No electricity, no plumbing. But it had walls and a roof. Elizabeth made a decision. She and Fritz would hide there until the war ended. Better to live in a freezing cabin than die in a bombing raid. They moved to the cabin in October 1944 for 2 months. Elizabeth and Fritz lived like people from another century. They collected firewood. They melted snow for water. They rationed their tiny food supply. Elizabeth had managed to salvage a little flour, some potatoes, a few precious eggs. Fritz, despite being only 12, became the man of the house. He learned to identify edible plants in the forest. He set snares for rabbits. He helped his mother keep the fire going. They had almost nothing. But they had each other. And they had hope that Herman would survive and come home when the war ended. Then, on December 16, 1944, everything changed. The German military launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive. Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last desperate gamble. 200,000 German troops smashed into thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The forest around Elizabeth's cabin became a battlefield. She and Fritz could hear artillery day and night. Machine gun fire echoed through the trees. At night, they saw flashes of light from explosions in the distance. American and German soldiers were fighting and dying within miles, maybe even hundreds of meters of their cabin. Elizabeth told Fritz, "We stay inside. We don't take sides. We help no one." We survive. For 8 days, they hid. They kept the fire as small as possible so smoke wouldn't give away their position. They barely spoke above whispers. Then came December 24th, Christmas Eve. Elizabeth had been saving food for weeks. She had one chicken, a miracle in wartime that she planned to roast for Christmas dinner. She had a handful of potatoes. She had baked a small loaf of bread using the last of her flour. It wasn't much, but it would be their Christmas dinner. A small moment of normalcy in the middle of hell. She and Fritz were preparing the meal when they heard the first knock. When Elizabeth opened the door and saw 3 American soldiers, her first thought wasn't about politics or sides or nations. Her first thought was, that boy is going to die. The wounded soldier, Private First Class. Jim Pritchard, from Pennsylvania, had been shot in the leg 2 days earlier. The bullet had gone clean through, but the wound was infected. He had developed a fever. His friends had been carrying him through the forest, trying to find friendly lines, but they were hopelessly lost. The other 2 soldiers were Corporal Ralph Blank from Ohio and Private First Class Robin Robinson from Virginia. Both were exhausted, half frozen, and terrified they would be captured or killed before they found their unit. They had seen the dim light from Elizabeth's cabin through the trees and made a desperate decision to knock, hoping whoever was inside might help them. Elizabeth pulled them inside and immediately went to work on Pritchard. She had Fritz bring clean snow to melt for water. She cleaned the wound with boiled water. She had no medicine, no bandages, except torn cloth. But she had dealt with injuries before, farm accidents, kitchen burns. She knew basics. Pritchard was delirious with fever. He kept mumbling about getting home and mother will worry. Elizabeth didn't understand his English, but she understood a mother's love. She covered him with their only extra blanket, the one she and Fritz had been using. Blank and Robinson watched in shocked silence as this German woman, whose country was technically their enemy, worked to save their friend's life. Robin Robinson later recalled, "She didn't ask if we were American or German. She didn't ask anything. She just, ... helped, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I'd been fighting for 6 months. I'd seen terrible things, but watching her care for Jim, that was the first time I remembered there was still good in the world." Elizabeth got Pritchard stabilized and lying near the wood stove for warmth. She turned to Blank and Robinson, and in broken German English made them understand they could stay. She would feed them, but they had to be quiet. The 2 Americans nodded. They were just grateful to be alive and warm. Fritz brought out the chicken Elizabeth had been preparing. She put it in their small oven to roast. The smell of cooking meat filled the cabin, a smell none of them had experienced in weeks. For 20 minutes, there was peace. Fritz sat in the corner, watching the Americans. The soldiers sat by the fire, warming their hands. Pritchard slept, his fever breaking slightly. Elizabeth tended the cooking chicken. It felt almost normal, almost safe. Then came the second knock on the door, and everything changed. When Elizabeth heard the second knock, she knew immediately it wasn't Americans. Americans had already knocked once. This knock was different, harder, more authoritative, military. Fritz's eyes went wide with terror. If German soldiers found Americans in the cabin, everyone would be shot. Elizabeth for treason. The Americans for being enemy soldiers. Maybe even Fritz for being a witness. Elizabeth Finken made a decision in that split second that defined her entire life. She turned to the Americans and hissed, "Pistolin, weapons, give." Blank and Robinson didn't understand at first. Elizabeth physically grabbed at their rifles and sidearms. Robinson finally understood. She wanted them disarmed before she opened the door. He whispered urgently to Blank, "Give her the weapons. Trust her." They handed over their M1 Garand rifles, their pistols, everything. Elizabeth quickly hid them under a floorboard. Then she opened the door. 4 German soldiers stood in the doorway, a Jeffreiter named Heinz, and 3 younger soldiers, whose names would later be remembered as Hermann, Karl, and Willy. They were from a Wehrmacht unit that had been separated from their main force during the Battle of the Bulge. They were lost, exhausted, and desperately cold. The corporal spoke rapidly in German, asking for shelter. Just for the night, they would leave at dawn. They meant no harm to civilians. Elizabeth looked at these 4 young German soldiers, boys, really, none older than 20, and saw the same desperation she'd seen in the Americans 30 minutes earlier. She made her second impossible decision of the night. She said, "You may enter, but we already have guests, Americans, and there will be no shooting in my house. This is Christmas Eve. The war stops at my door." The German corporal stared at her like she'd lost her mind. One of the younger soldiers reached for his rifle. Elizabeth stepped forward, a middle-aged baker's wife, with nothing but moral authority, and said the words that would become legendary. "Es ist Heiligebend. Higher word, nicht geschossen. It is Christmas Eve. There will be no shooting." Here, the German corporal looked past her, into the cabin. He could see the Americans by the fire. 2 healthy soldiers, and 1 clearly wounded. He could smell the chicken cooking. He looked back at Elizabeth. Then he did something extraordinary. He turned to his men and ordered them to hand over their weapons. The younger soldiers protested in rapid German. The corporal cut them off. "She's right. It's Christmas. Give her the guns, one by one." The 4 German soldiers handed their car, 9 8K rifles and Luger pistols to a civilian woman. She added them to the hidden pile under the floorboard. Then she opened the door wide and said, "Enter. Sit. You will eat together." 7 enemy soldiers walked into a 1-room cabin. 3 Americans, 4 Germans. All of them armed an hour ago. All of them trained to kill each other. And 1 unarmed woman told them they would sit together and share Christmas dinner. Nobody moved. The Americans and Germans stared at each other across the tiny cabin. Fritz, watching from the corner, later said the tension was like lightning about to strike. Then, Elizabeth Finken did the most powerful thing she could do. She went back to cooking dinner. She checked the chicken. She peeled potatoes. She hummed a German Christmas carol. She acted like having 7 enemy soldiers in her cabin on Christmas Eve was perfectly normal. And slowly, incredibly, the soldiers began to relax. For the first 10 minutes, nobody spoke. The German soldiers sat on one side of the cabin. The Americans sat on the other. Fritz stayed in his corner, watching everything with wide, 12-year-old eyes. The wounded American Pritchard remained unconscious near the stove, occasionally mumbling in fever dreams. Then one of the German soldiers, Hermann, the youngest, at 17, broke the silence. He pointed at Pritchard and asked in German, though one did. The American corporal, Blank, understood the tone, if not the words. He nodded. "Yes. Shot, 2 days ago." Hermann stood slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. He walked across the invisible line dividing the cabin. He knelt beside Pritchard and examined the wound. Then he said something in German. Elizabeth translated into broken English, he says. He was medical training, before soldier. He can help. Herman had been a medical orderly before being pressed into combat duty. He had basic first aid training. He looked at Elizabeth and asked if she had any alcohol. She had a small bottle of schnapps, meant for cooking. Herman used it to reclean Pritchard's wound, then wrapped it more professionally than Elizabeth had been able to. He felt Pritchard's forehead, checked his pulse. He said to Elizabeth, in German, "He'll live. The fever is breaking. He just needs rest and food." When Elizabeth translated this to the Americans, something shifted in the cabin. Robinson, the other American private, looked at Herman with something other than hatred. He said quietly, "Thank you." Herman didn't understand English, but he understood gratitude. He nodded. The ice was beginning to break. Elizabeth announced dinner was ready. She had 1 roasted chicken, 6 potatoes, 1 small loaf of bread. She had to feed 9 people herself, Fritz, and 7 soldiers. She divided it with perfect equality. Everyone got the same portion, regardless of nationality. When the German corporal tried to give his chicken to the wounded American, Elizabeth stopped him. "Everyone eats the same," she said, firmly. "In this house, tonight, you are not soldiers. You are guests." They ate in silence at first. But it's hard to hate someone while sharing a meal with them. One of the German soldiers, Willie, noticed Fritz watching from the corner, and smiled at him. He motioned for Fritz to come sit with them. Fritz looked at his mother, who nodded. Fritz later recalled, "I sat between an American and a German. They both patted my head. The American gave me a piece of his chocolate bar. The German gave me a button from his uniform as a souvenir. I thought, they're just regular people. Like my father, like me." After dinner, someone started humming, "Still Nacht, Silent Night." Within moments, everyone was singing. The Germans sang in German. The Americans sang in English. The melody was the same. Asterisk still Nohet. Hallig. Nacht. ... Asterisk. Asterisk Silent Night. Holy Night. ... Asterisk 7 enemy soldiers, singing the same Christmas carol in different languages, in a tiny cabin in the middle of a war. Elizabeth Vinken later said, "That was the moment I knew God was in that room, because nothing else could explain it." After singing, they began trying to communicate. None of the Americans spoke German. Only the German corporal knew a little English. But they used hand gestures, drawings, even laughter to bridge the gap. The German soldiers showed photos of their families. The Americans showed photos of theirs. They discovered they had more in common than they thought. Blank's father was a farmer. Carl's father was a farmer. Robinson's brother was fighting in Italy. Willie's brother was fighting in Italy. They were boys from rural areas, fighting in a war they didn't start, missing their families, wanting to go home. By 10 p.m., the cabin had transformed from a tense standoff into something impossible to describe. It wasn't friendship exactly. The war still existed outside those walls. But it was human connection. Recognition that the person across from you was someone's son, someone's brother, someone who wanted to live. When midnight came, Christmas Day, Elizabeth said a prayer in German. The soldiers bowed their heads, regardless of language or nationality. She prayed for peace, for their families, for an end to the war. When she finished, the German corporal said, "Amen," and every soldier in that cabin, German and American, repeated, "Amen." They slept that night in the same room. No weapons, no guards, just exhausted soldiers, getting the first real sleep they'd had in weeks. Fritz slept between his mother and the fire, watching the soldiers sleep. He later recalled, "I thought, if they can stop fighting for one night, why can't everyone?" December 25, 1944, 6 a.m. Fritz woke first. The cabin was freezing. The fire had burned down to embers during the night. All 7 soldiers were still asleep, crowded together for warmth. The wounded American, Pritchard, was awake. His fever had broken. He was weak but conscious. He looked at Fritz and managed a smile. Elizabeth woke and immediately began preparing breakfast. She had almost nothing left, just some bread, heated water for Erzot's coffee made from roasted acorns. But she divided it equally again. As the soldiers woke, reality began returning. Outside the cabin, the war was still happening. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its 9th day. Thousands of soldiers were fighting and dying in the forest around them. The German corporal, Heinz, spoke first. In halting English, he said to the Americans, "We must go. Different directions. You go west to your lines. We go east 2 hours." Ralph Blanc nodded. "How do we get to American lines?" The German corporal pulled out a map. For 10 minutes, enemy soldiers studied the map together. The Germans showed the Americans where they thought American positions were. They marked German positions to avoid. They gave tactical advice on how to move through the forest without being spotted. Then the Americans did the same for the Germans, showing them safe routes back to German lines. They were literally helping each other survive against their own armies. Before they left, Hermann, the young German with medical training, changed Pritchard's bandage one final time. He showed Blank and Robinson how to keep the wound clean. He said in German, which Elizabeth translated, "Tell him, he'll be fine. The leg will heal. He'll walk again." Then came the moment Elizabeth had been dreading. She returned their weapons. She pulled out the rifles and pistols from under the floorboard and handed them back. The soldiers took them silently, loading them, becoming warriors again. For a moment, everyone stood there, armed enemies facing each other in a tiny cabin. Then something happened that Fritz would remember for the rest of his life. The German corporal extended his hand to Ralph Blank. Blank looked at that hand for a long moment. Then he shook it. "Frau Weihnachten," the German said. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," Blank replied. One by one, all 7 soldiers shook hands. German and American. Enemy and enemy. But also human and human. Then they left. Americans headed west. Germans headed east. Back to the war. Back to killing each other. Elizabeth watched them disappear into the forest. She looked at Fritz and said, "Remember this. Remember that they were good men." All of them. Fritz nodded. He would never forget. The war ended 4 months later, in May 1945. Of the 7 soldiers who shared that Christmas dinner, 5 survived the war. 2 died in combat before May. Hermann, the 17-year-old German medic, was killed in January 1945 during the final collapse of the German lines. He was shot while treating wounded soldiers, German and American both. Karl, one of the other young German soldiers, died in April 1945, less than 2 weeks before Germany surrendered. He was killed by artillery near Berlin. The other 5 survived. Ralph Blank returned to Ohio, married his sweetheart, became a teacher. For years, he told no one about that Christmas except his wife. Robin Robinson went home to Virginia, took over his father's farm, raised 4 children. He sometimes woke up at night, remembering that cabin. Jim Pritchard, the wounded soldier whose life Elizabeth saved, recovered fully. He walked with a slight limp for the rest of his life, but he walked. He became a postal worker in Pennsylvania. The German corporal, Heinz, was captured by American forces in March 1945. He spent 2 years in a POW camp, then returned to Germany to find his hometown destroyed. He helped rebuild it, became a shopkeeper. Willie, the youngest German survivor, emigrated to Argentina after the war, trying to escape his memories. But he never forgot that cabin. Elizabeth and Fritz Winken stayed in Germany. Fritz grew up, became a baker like his father had been. In 1964, he emigrated to Hawaii with his wife and children, seeking a new life far from the war-scarred landscapes of Europe. For 29 years, none of them talked about that Christmas. It was too strange. Too impossible. Who would believe it? But Fritz couldn't forget. On Christmas Eve, every year, he would tell his children about that night. They thought it was a beautiful fairy tale. In 1973, Fritz, now 41 years old, decided to write it down. He submitted it to Asterisk Reader's Digest, Asterisk magazine, with a simple note. "This is true. I was there. The editor was skeptical. The story seemed too perfect. Too Hollywood. But Fritz provided dates, locations, specific details about the Battle of the Bulge that matched military records. The magazine published it in January 1973 under the title The Truce in the Forest. And then the letters started arriving. Within weeks of publication, Fritz received a letter from Ohio. It was from Ralph Blank. "I was there," the letter said. "I was one of the Americans. I never forgot your mother's kindness. I never forgot that night." Fritz broke down crying when he read it. For 3 decades, he'd wondered if the other men remembered, if they had survived, if they ever thought about that impossible Christmas. More letters came. Robin Robinson wrote from Virginia. Jim Pritchard wrote from Pennsylvania. Each of them had read the article and recognized the story immediately. Even the German survivors reached out. Heinz wrote from West Germany. Willie wrote from Argentina. 5 men scattered across 3 continents who had shared one meal on one night in 1944. In 1995, the Los Angeles Times did a feature story on the Christmas truce. They brought Fritz together with Ralph Blank, the first time they'd seen each other in 51 years. Both men were in their 70s now. Ralph walked into the room where Fritz was waiting. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Then Fritz said, "You remember the chicken?" Ralph laughed. "I remember everything." They embraced, like brothers. Similar reunions happened with the other survivors. These men who had been trained to kill each other spent the last years of their lives as friends. They called each other on birthdays. They sent Christmas cards. They visited when they could. Jim Pritchard, the wounded American whose life Elizabeth saved, tried for years to find her, to thank her. But Elizabeth had died in 1983, never knowing that the men she'd saved were looking for her. But in 1996, Pritchard traveled to Germany with his family. He found the cabin still standing, abandoned, now deep in the Ardennes forest. He walked inside, to the exact spot where he'd laid wounded on Christmas Eve, 1944. He knelt down and prayed. He thanked Elizabeth Vinken, wherever she was, for giving him a chance to live, to marry, to have children and grandchildren. He left flowers on the cabin floor. Today, the cabin where the Christmas miracle happened is a memorial. A small plaque outside tells the story in German, English, and French. Every Christmas Eve, people from around the world visit that cabin. They leave candles. They leave flowers. They leave notes thanking Elizabeth Vinken for showing that humanity can survive even in the darkest moments. The story has been told in books, documentaries, even adapted for television. But no retelling can capture what it meant to the men who lived it. Robin Robinson, before he died in 2004, said, "People ask me what I learned in the war. I learned how to shoot, how to survive, how to hate. But the most important thing I learned happened in that cabin. I learned that the enemy is only the enemy until you see him as a person. Then he's just another scared kid who wants to go home." Ralph Blanc died in 2008. His children found a letter he'd written to be read at his funeral. In it, he wrote, "I killed men in the war. I did my duty. But I also sat with men I was supposed to kill, and we sang Christmas carols together. Both things are true. War makes you do terrible things. But it can also show you the best of humanity. That Christmas Eve in 1944 showed me that hope exists even in hell." Fritz Vinken died in 2008 at age 76. His family asked that instead of flowers, people donate to organizations helping war refugees. People like his mother had been searching for safety in dangerous places. Elizabeth Vinken never knew her story would inspire millions. She never knew that 7 decades later, people would still talk about what she did on December 24, 1944. She just knew that on Christmas Eve, in her house, the war would stop. 1 mother, 7 soldiers, 1 meal. And for 12 hours, peace on earth wasn't just a phrase in a carol, it was real. The Christmas miracle of 1944 reminds us that we get to choose. In any moment, we can choose hate or humanity, fear or courage, violence or peace. Elizabeth Vinken chose humanity, and 7 men lived because of it. This Christmas, remember their story. Not because it's sentimental, not because it's heartwarming. Remember it because it's true. And if one woman could stop a war in her cabin for one night, maybe we can stop it in our hearts every day. That's what Christmas is really about. Not presents, not decorations, but recognizing the humanity in everyone, even the enemy, especially the enemy. Merry Christmas. And may we all find the courage Elizabeth Vinken showed in that cabin. Word count, approximately 6,500 words, estimated narration time, 50 to 60 minutes. Why this story works for older audiences. Nostalgia. Many older viewers remember WW2 stories from parents, grandparents. Emotion. Makes people cry, they will share this. Universal themes, motherhood, sacrifice, humanity over ideology, Christmas connection. Perfect for holiday season, will resurface every year. No gore, just heart. Appropriate for all ages, shareable with family. Real history, verified true story, not Hollywood fiction. Hope, ends on uplifting note. People want hope, not depression. Personal connection, makes viewers remember their own family war stories. This is the kind of video people watch with their families on Christmas Eve.